Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope everyone is doing well. Okay, so we are going to continue with Chapter 2. So this is Chapter 2, Bill Clinton Part 2. And it starts with Eurocorps. What were the other alternatives? Of course, American libertarians, paleoconservatives, and leftists recommended independence and neutrality, while everyone else on the political spectrum insisted on some form of foreign presence, especially in Europe. In 1998, in reaction to American mendacity in Bosnia, the French and Germans expanded their small Eurocorps force to guarantee security on the continent with autonomy from NATO. And even the British signaled their willingness to cooperate with this attempted new alignment. In this case, NATO could have at least been relegated to a simple treaty rather than its own massive, independent, and expansionist military bureaucracy. However, the proposal was fiercely denounced by former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher as threatening NATO and therefore American predominance in Western military structures. No, the real drive towards a separate European defense is the same as that towards a single European currency, namely the utopian venture of creating a single European superstate to rival the U.S. on the world stage, she warned. President Bush, the State Department, and the Defense Department all put out similar warnings. It was certainly true that, as the French Foreign Ministry put it, they meant to dilute U.S. power in Europe. But after American-led NATO intervention in the Balkans, U.S. dominance remained assured, as through the present day. Though the EU created a small-time, rapid reaction force, it saw light duty and has not been a challenge to Washington and NATO's hegemony in Europe. Early warning, my guy. The Libertarian Institute's Ted Gallon Carpenter not only warned against NATO expansion from the beginning, but also perfectly predicted what the result would be. In his 1994 book, Beyond NATO, Staying Out of Europe's Wars, Carpenter wrote it would be extraordinarily difficult to expand NATO eastward without that action being reviewed by Russia as unfriendly. Even the most modest schemes would bring the alliance to the borders of the old Soviet Union. He noted that some of the more ambitious versions would have the alliance virtually surround the Russian Federation itself. Expansion, Carpenter warned, would constitute a needless provocation of Russia. Hey guys, so it's that time where I need to ask you to subscribe to the channel, and if you're already subscribed, just hit the like, please. If you don't do this, I will be abducted by aliens. Thanks! Go, Pat, go. Pat Buchanan, the former Nixon and Reagan speechwriter and confidant, first Cold Warrior president candidate and political commentator, warned in 1999 that every major political faction in Russia considered expansion to be in bad faith and exploiting Russia's weakened position. We soothingly reassure Moscow that NATO's expansion is benign, but if the Russians gave war guarantees to Mexico and began arming and training Mexican troops, would any Russian reassurance diminish our determination to run them out of our hemisphere? Buchanan also warned that if rising resentment in Russia leads to Yeltsin's replacement with an anti-American nationalist, full blame must rest squarely with a haughty U.S. elite that has done its best to humiliate Russia. He then demanded to know why we are doing this. This is not 1948. This is not 1948. Stalin is dead. The Soviet Empire is dead. The Soviet Union is dead. European Russia is smaller than the Russia of Peter the Great. He maintained that a friendly Russia is far more critical to U.S. security than any alliance with Warsaw or Prague. If the United States has one overriding national security interest in the new century, it is to avoid collisions with great nuclear powers like Russia. Buchanan predicted, by moving NATO to Russia's front porch, we have scheduled a 21st century confrontation. America will likely face a hellish dilemma: risk confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia determined to create its old sphere of influence, or renege on solemn commitments and see NATO collapse. Therefore, he said, offering NATO membership to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and some urge Ukraine is rash, bordering on madness. Referring to maps the Clinton team must have ignored, Buchanan warned, this would put the Russian base at Kaliningrad behind NATO lines and bring into a US-led alliance three nations with huge Russian minorities. Foreseeing future conflict, he observed that Latvia is almost half Russian, eastern Ukraine almost entirely Russian. America could neither defend nor liberate these nations without the risk of nuclear war. Kennan's dissent. But it was not just the libertarians and paleoconservatives. In fact, a majority of the relevant government officials involved were opposed, including former and current cabinet secretaries, diplomats, military officers, and experts. George Kennan was at the time considered to be the wisest and highest ranking of the retired foreign policy graybeards. He had been the famous ambassador to the Soviet Union who helped inaugurate the first Cold War back in the aftermath of World War II and coined the containment policy in his important long telegram cable of 1946, as well as anonymously written article for Foreign Affairs on the sources of Soviet conduct signed by X in 1947. For generations after, Western leaders sought his advice on dealing with the Soviets. At a dinner at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University in October 1996, Kennan called NATO expansion a strategic blunder of potentially epic proportions. He wrote a piece called A Fatal Error for the New York Times in 1997, denouncing the policy of NATO expansion. He said the decision was the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era, which would inflame the existing nationalistic, anti-Western, militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking. He said he expected the result to be a new Cold War, probably ending in a hot one, and the end of the effort to achieve a workable democracy in Russia. Most quotably, Kennan complained to the Times' Thomas L. Friedman in 1998, "I think NATO expansion is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely and it will affect their policies. I think it is a strategic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. We have signed up to protect a whole series of countries, even though we have neither the resources nor the intention to do so in any serious way. Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime, and now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. Of course there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong." Kennan's prediction are present. He even foresaw that once Russia does react negatively and take steps to push back, the hawks would point to those actions as post-hoc justification for everything the U.S. did to contribute to the crisis in the first place. Friedman had written back in November 1996, "For my money, NATO expansion is the most ill-conceived project of the post-Cold War era," betraying a skepticism missing from his prognostications during the terror wars. Friedman wrote that expansion proponents insist it can be done without disrupting relations with Russia or orphaning those Europeans like the Balts and the Ukrainians who will be left out. Well, let's see. Strobe's yellow light. Nelson Strobe Talbot III, so his nickname is Strobe, was Clinton's roommate when they were Rhodes Scholars at Oxford. He later became Clinton's primary advisor on Russia during the transition, then ambassador at large to the former Soviet states, and later Deputy Secretary of State. According to the Wilson Center, he sat in every Clinton-Yeltsin meeting and otherwise managed the Bill-Boris relationship. Originally more than a woolly-headed worlder, Talbot had opposed NATO expansion when ambassador at large due to the presumed Russian reaction. He later wrote that he was deeply riven about it, but Talbot changed his mind by April 1994 after being promoted to Deputy Secretary of State. He soon became one of the biggest promoters of NATO expansion inside the administration. The decision to expand had been finalized in January 1994 at the NATO summit in Brussels. At the urging of President Clinton, the leaders agreed that the alliance should expand. Talbot later wrote, he said that leaders of the new proposed military states were ambivalent, skeptical, or suspicious about the very idea of enlarging NATO. They worry that if they were not in the first group admitted, or second or third, they will end up on the wrong side of a new Iron Curtain. He acknowledged that in Russia, ultranationalists condemn the decision to expand as nothing less than the declaration of a new Cold War, and many reformers fear that precisely this sinister view will strengthen anti-democratic elements in Russian politics. Arguing that NATO will help to promote democratic and economic reform in tandem with the European Union and citing Italian and German integration into the American-led order after the Second World War, Talbot still warned that one of the most difficult challenges to enlarging NATO is its effect on Russia. Many Russians see NATO as a vestige of the Cold War, inherently directed against their country. They thought NATO should have been abolished along with the Warsaw Pact and see the plan to take in new members as a Western vote of no confidence in the staying power of Russian reform. It makes them feel as though Russia is still on probation, still subject to a thinly disguised policy of containment. He said that if NATO adopted an anti-Russian rationale for taking in new members, it could tip the balance of forces in Russian politics to exactly the direction that we most feared, and that these suspicions and warnings reverberate across the Russian political spectrum. Since every kind of reactionary was exploiting the issue, the reformers who are committed to consolidation of Russian democracy and to Russians' increasing integration into the West also tend to oppose NATO enlargement. Talbot's prescription to go ahead anyway was the beginning of a terrible self-fulfilling prophecy. In his memoir, Talbot wrote that Clinton had confronted him about Kennan's opposition. Why isn't Kennan right? Isn't he the kind of guru of yours going back to when we were at Oxford? Talbot wrote that he believed Clinton was not just testing him for future public relation purposes, but in this case, there was a hint of doubt about the policy itself, not the desirability of expanding NATO, but the feasibility of reconciling it with the integration of Russia. Talbot wrote, as the engineer in this locomotive, he was troubled by this latest forecast of a train from a revered figure with a reputation for being prophetic about Russia. But he dismissed Clinton's newfound concerns. Sure, Kennan had been and always would be someone I admired, but not as a source of all wisdom. Kennan had opposed the formation of NATO in the first place. I said, so it was no great surprise that he opposed its enlargement. Clinton furrowed his brow and thought about my answer, then broke into a smile. Just checking, Strobe, just checking. In Talbot's response to Kennan's letter warning about his upcoming public dissent, the protege assured his mentor that he had shown the timepiece to the principals and that while they appreciated the advice, he stressed the need to contain a potentially aggressive Russia and side benefits like the incentive for countries to maintain civilian supremacy over their militaries and overall stability for the continent, the political element of the alliance they were always talking about. As far as the Russians, Talbot wrote, once again, for the president, a profoundly difficult issue came down to a starkly simple choice. Should Russia's acute aversion to enlargement keep the process from going forward? Yes or no? The president decided the only right answer was no, but they had no real answer to the problems that Kennan had raised. The Russians would just have to settle for understanding and arrangements to assuage their legitimate political and security concerns. He said, thereby managing the difficulties in U.S.-Russian relations that inevitably arise over enlargement. It was wishful thinking at best, epitomized by statements like, The NATO that is getting ready to take in new members is already a new NATO, not the old Cold War model. The only thing new was that the alliance was bigger and more powerful, while its primary enemy had been completely emasculated. Claiming it was anything but a military alliance, still directed at Russia, was just obfuscation. All stars. Many of the most respected Cold War hawks and experts at the State and Defense Departments, Council on Foreign Relations, and academia warned against the policy and predicted what was likely to happen. They included President Bush Sr.'s former National Security Advisor and close friend General Brent Scowcroft, Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense Les Aspin, and William Perry, his ambassador to Russia, Thomas Pickering, George Kennan, and his one-time protege and later greatest professional rival, Paul Nitze. The former Deputy Secretary of Defense and Special Advisor to Ronald Reagan, who had previously favored the more aggressive policy of rollback rather than just containment of Soviet power. Warnings also came from Robert S. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during most of the war in Vietnam, former CIA directors Stanfield Turner and Robert Gates, who was later Secretary of Defense under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, Jack Matlock, the second to last ambassador to the USSR, Senators Daniel Patrick Moynihan, John Warner, Sam Nunn, Bill Bradley, and Paul Wellstone, anti-communist academics Richard Pipes and Edward Lutwak, and dozens more of the highest-ranking generals, admirals, and foreign service officers, including Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Shalhaskaveli, and military advisor to the State Department, Lieutenant General Barry McCaffrey, all warned Clinton not to go through with it. According to the Council on Foreign Relations and Columbian University scholar Kimberly Martin, the majority of Russian experts at the State Department also opposed expansion, since they argued Moscow would see expansion as being directed against it, and this might create a self-fulfilling prophecy of nationalist backlash. Why does everyone have crazy names? It is so hard to pronounce these names for me for some reason. In 1997, Matlock told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that if they approved the policy, it may well go down in history as the most profound strategic blunder made since the end of the Cold War. He warned that rather than improving security, it could well encourage a chain of events that could produce the most serious security threat to this nation since the Soviet Union collapsed. Also in 1997, an open letter signed by former President Eisenhower's granddaughter Susan and 50 important foreign policy establishment leaders warned in part the U.S.-led effort to expand NATO is a policy error of historic proportions. We believe that NATO expansion would decrease Allied security and unsettle European stability. They warned that expansion would strengthen Russian hardliners and marginalize the Democrats, provoke their re-evaluation of post-Cold War settlement, galvanize resistance to signing important nuclear treaties, and spread instability and fear throughout Europe by moving the line, but excluding for the time being many smaller countries who would be threatened by the Russian reaction. They also warned that NATO's primary defense mission would be diminished and that many of the nations in question had open issues with their borders and national minorities. Sounds like a giant mess. I don't know why we have to get involved in all this stuff. I'm not a isolationist. I do think we should have strategic, dominance over certain areas and stuff like that. But I just feel like there's so much going on and so much that has gone on that is just very unnecessary. Ted Sorensen, a former advisor to President John F. Kennedy, unequivocally denounced expansion. Such a move would force the United States to defend these new members by both nuclear and conventional means. while harming relations with excluded Central and Eastern European nations, especially Russia's reinsurgent nationalists. He mocked the mindlessness of the policy. So this is a quote. It's hard to imagine a more provocative decision taken with less consultation and consideration for the consequences, but so what? Let's do it our way, end quote. A lot of this stuff is just quotes. And like half of the page on each one of these pages is footnotes to articles and documents that you can look up yourself. So if you bought the book, you would have all the footnotes. Olga Oliger, director of the Russian and Eurasian program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, said that the Russians took NATO expansion as a sign that we were still against them. It was really hard to walk back from. She added, from there on out, we were doing things that the Russians felt hurt them. We didn't do it because we wanted to hurt them. We did it because we didn't care if it hurt them. Oliker explained that American policymakers just could not understand the Russians' point of view. I was testifying on the Hill not long ago, and I was saying the Russians think they're acting defensively, and the senators were like, but we've explained to them over and over that we're not a threat. Like, are you serious? Even the New York Times editorial board was against it. They warned that expansion could strengthen Russian nationalists opposed to Boris Yeltsin and his Western-oriented reformers. Will the U.S. extend its nuclear umbrella to Eastern Europe? Above all, how can Russia be included or be reconciled to being excluded? They argued that it would be far better for President Clinton to join his European counterparts in seeking a more creative solutions for Europe's problems. Veteran Democrat Dennis Ross, who had been director of policy planning under Jim Baker in the H.W. Bush years, wrote a memo to Talbot warning that the Russians see NATO expansion through a political, psychological, and historical lens. Fortunately, it tends to confirm the imagery that they lost the Cold War, their status as a great power is collapsing, and they continue to be humiliated, and worse, they will face potential threats closer to their borders. So that's like another thing. America, like something we do as Americans is we fail to see how things look to other countries when we're doing them. So we feel a way about something. And I'm not saying it's wrong to feel that way, like, of course. So, like, let me think of an example. Okay, so we look at Iran killing the 214 Marines. We remember that as a terrible thing. Like, we still remember it, right? And we hold that against Iran, naturally. And then, but Iran remembers things that we did to them, and they hold it against us naturally. Right? So I think, I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was something we did that killed quite a lot of Iranians. Let me see if I can look it up. Okay, I don't know if this is exactly what I was thinking of, but there's a few incidences listed here. So there was, I will have to look into, I might be thinking of a completely different country, but there was an incident. Where is it? I just lost it. Okay, so during the British and US led coup, there were a bunch of clashes that roughly resulted in 200 to 300 deaths. There was US accidentally shooting down Iran Air Flight 655 in 1988, killing 290 civilians. This occurred in the context of the Iran-Iraq war. I feel like there was something else, but it's not popping up. It doesn't really matter. My point is that we look at these things as the things that are done to us, right, in a negative way onto the country that it happened, because those are our people and we feel really strongly about it. But we fail to take into account that other countries have the same feelings. They're humans just like we are. And so when we do things to them, we don't look at it the same way. You know what I mean? We don't take it in the same way. And I'm certainly not defending like Iran or anything, of course. And they have continued to do crazy stuff. I'm just like trying to bring nuance to the topic here where we don't in this situation that we're reading in the book, we our leaders didn't stop to think about how Russia felt to be a great empire. Then they went through this terrible time where they were under communism, and then they also lost so many people to World War II, and then they just totally collapsed as a regime. Their government collapsed, their economy collapsed. They had to rebuild themselves back up, and so they were very vulnerable feeling at the time, and they felt like they were being humiliated like over and over again by America. And just like how we have pride in ourselves and that it's humiliating for other countries to do things to us, like, for example, Iran killing our Marines and then nothing happening, like many people cite, that makes us feel shame as a nation. Like, those are our people. We want when our people are hurt to be backed up, when we're being disrespected, we don't like that. Well, other countries feel the same way. You know what I mean? But we don't take that into account. He said this was giving the nationalist right a field day and that the U.S. desperately needed to come up with an alternative bit of counter imagery for how the question was portrayed in Russia. Ross also reminded Talbot that they already had agreed that the Russians feel they were snookered at the time of German unification. And as you noted with me, Baker's promises on not extending NATO military presence into what was Eastern Germany were part of a perceived commitment not to expand the alliance eastward. He added, the 1991 promise to begin to transform NATO from a military alliance was part of the Soviet explanation for accepting a unified Germany to NATO. Today, I believe the Russians feel both promises should have been more of a binding and precise character. As a result, they are taking the lessons of 1991 and they are trying to apply them now in the negotiations on NATO expansion. He was not urging restraint on the policy, only caution on the politics. The U.S. needed to do the bare minimum to make sure that Yeltsin would have something he could present to their public to show their needs were addressed and satisfied. See, that's another thing. Like, they're trying to, like, they just, right, got out of communism, they elected a president, and then they see the president getting completely run over by the Americans who were their enemies like 5 minutes ago. And so it's not looking good. Like, if you're a politician, you know what I mean? You gotta do things that keeps the public satisfied with you. And America was making it really difficult for that process. I mean, just like think about it. Kimberly Martin on the Council on Foreign Relations wrote that the anti-expansion forces in the foreign policy community were prominent and large in number, and they were too late and had failed to win champions in Congress. Kennan's article and Eisenhower's et al.'s letter were not published until 1997, long after the final formal decision had already been made at the NATO ministries meeting in September 1996. Enlargement opponents had missed the boat. Senate debate. In 1998, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, one of the most respected intellectuals in the Senate at the time and very close to the neoconservative set, warned that bringing Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, and possibly the Baltic states into NATO would antagonize Russia, saying the policy was akin to building an iron ring around them. We're walking into ethnic, historical enmities. Moyen said we have no idea what we're getting into. But then Senator Biden, a leader voice for NATO expansion, would not have it. He began by accusing Moynihan of justifying Stalin's seizure of the Baltics generations ago, which was not at all what Moynihan was saying. A reporter from the Times was a witness. Stalking the Senate floor, flailing his arms, Mr. Biden continued for 10 minutes. Biden swore he had no idea what Moynihan was talking about. So this is a quote. from Biden, I believe. If my friends are saying anyone who votes for expanding NATO to include Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary are tying this noose around a Russian neck, this iron ring, well, then I don't quite get it, he said, after Virginia Senator John Warner warned that an expansion could see Americans dragged into other nations' ethnic conflicts and no-win quagmires like Somalia and Vietnam. Biden ranted, Vietnam and Somalia are not Central Europe. They're not Poland. They're not Hungary. Look, I'm going to be real honest with you guys. If I can't get people to subscribe or like, YouTube will literally send aliens to my house. Do you want me to be probed? I need you to like and to subscribe. Thank you. However, only a few months before, Biden had revealed that he understood what was at stake for the Russians. He told the Atlantic Council that he understood that unlike the Visegrad states, Poland and Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, bringing in the Baltics would drive major consternation in Russia. Quote, if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reactions in Russia, I don't mean militarily, it would be that. However, he assured the crowd, I was once told to be in this business, you must be an optimist. Some would suggest it is too optimistic a view. I believe with time meaning in the next several years, we will solve this. Democratic Senator Paul Wellstone disagreed, saying he was very worried NATO expansion could mean a redivision of Europe, causing a poisoning of relations with Russia and ultranationalists coming into power. The Wall Street Journal also said that the most sensitive question is whether ever to admit the three Baltic states, a move certain to infuriate Moscow. Dividing lines. President Clinton had said they would build and secure a new Europe, peaceful, democratic, and undivided at last. But he wasn't uniting Europe, he was dividing it. Ambassador Matlock warned that if they were to exclude Russia from the expanded alliance, it would necessarily be against them. Let's look at a map, why don't we? Maps are fun. Okay, so I put a map on the screen. Europe is technically everything you see in gray, and Russia goes even farther this way, but I guess they don't consider this farther part, Europe. So up here you have Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Finland borders Russia right here. Then you have these smaller countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then Belarus here. Estonia and Latvia border Russia. Belarus borders Russia. Here's Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic right here under Poland. Ukraine borders Russia, and this is the really important border to them because these, like Finland, a lot of that is like mountainous areas that's bordering them. So it's not an easy way to get into their country militarily, right? And same with a lot of these smaller ones, but Ukraine is perfect for that. That's the way, if you were going to seize into their country, you would go that way. And currently, Ukraine, through the help of the CIA giving them intelligence, is hitting the inside Russia with drones and targeting their infrastructure and stuff like that. And there was even an assassination attempt on Putin himself, it is believed, because they hit one of his residences. So that's not good, right? Down here, remember we looked at these the other day when we were reading about Serbia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina, Macedonia. Those are all right here, sort of like close to Ukraine like this. And so you have all these, this is all considered Eastern Europe. And then all this over here, once you get to Germany and Austria and Italy, Switzerland, all this is considered Western Europe. Spain, England, but this is all technically Europe. So when they're saying like we're splitting up Europe because we're sort of leaving out certain countries, right? And then completely isolating Russia. Who is Russia supposed to be friends with? Who are they supposed to trade with? Who are they supposed to have, commerce with and partnerships with and stuff like that if they're just completely being isolated from the rest of Europe? It's sort of weird to behave that way towards them, in my opinion, and apparently in the opinion of a bunch of other people that were in government at the time and thinkers. Okay, so I will leave the map up for a little while. Ambassador Matlock warned that if they were to exclude Russia from the expanded alliance, it would necessarily be against them. The last Cold War had ended more than 2 years before the final fall of the USSR, and now the USA was already on the path of restarting it again. Former Secretary of State Kissinger, a strong proponent of expansionism, admitted this was so, writing in the Los Angeles Times that, quote, the new members are seeking to participate in NATO, not to erase dividing lines, but to position themselves inside a guaranteed territory by shifting existing NATO boundaries 300 miles to the east. His Democratic counterpart, Brzezinski, also acknowledged that, quote, the delusion of a shared global status with America made it difficult for the Moscow political elite to abandon the idea of a privileged geopolitical position for Russia, not only in the area of the former Soviet Union itself, but even in regard to the former Central European satellite states. Eugene J. Carroll Jr., a retired Navy Rear Admiral and Deputy Director of the Center for Defense Information, criticized advocates of NATO expansion, including Kissinger, in a 1997 essay in the Los Angeles Times. Referring to Kissinger's acknowledgement that they were just moving the dividing line further east, Carroll wrote that this admission also provided a clear picture of Moscow's perception of a new NATO threat moved closer to its borders. This picture also reveals that at its heart, NATO expansion is aimed at Russia. He referred to new Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's testimony to the Senate on the off chance that, in fact, Russia doesn't work out the way we were hoping it will, NATO is there, adding, it may be safe to treat Russia as a prospective enemy today when it helps to prevent NATO expansion, but there is the longer-term danger. A hardline anti-Western coalition will be strengthened in Moscow and give priority to anti-NATO measures in the future. Well, they really lucked out, honestly, and it's sort of a miracle in my mind that they got Putin in there because he's actually very moderate, as you can see in his policies that have gone on since he replaced Yeltsin. He wasn't president for a little while. Medvedev, I believe was his name, was in there, and then he got back into the presidency after him, and then he's been in there ever since. There are quite a few very hardliners that are very upset with the way they're constantly being treated. So I really feel like we should get all this worked out and getting on a better path before Putin leaves, because he's really been a moderate over this period of time and has really held off. He didn't even want to have to deal with the situation in Ukraine for years and years, like almost a decade. He tried to deal with it diplomatically by constantly bringing the issue up and having bilateral meetings and stuff about it. And that's what the Minsk 1 agreements were that didn't get followed. So then they had to like re-meet and go over everything. And then that's what the Minsk 2 agreements were supposed to do, was deal with that situation that then didn't get dealt with. And then the United States did a color revolution, which caused the Maidan revolution in Western Ukraine, that then turned on all the citizens in the eastern part of Ukraine, and there were brutal murders, people were burned alive, and then that created hostilities between eastern and western Ukraine, and there was a civil war going on for quite a long time before Russia finally stepped in. But they were trying to get that whole situation worked out, and it wasn't working out very well. There's several documentaries on all that if you guys want to check it out. They're hard to find on YouTube, but you can find the burning of Odessa on Odyssey. I believe that's what it's called, or Odessa burning, something like that. It is extremely graphic, I will warn you. And then another good movie to watch is Oliver Stone's The Putin Interviews, parts 1 through 4, which you can find that on Odyssey as well for free. Or you can buy it on Amazon. It's not very expensive. Experienced Ambassador Dean. Jonathan Gunther Dean, a career Foreign Service officer and former ambassador to Cambodia and Lebanon, then senior arms control advisor from the Union of Concerned Scientists, wrote in 1995 that NATO expansion was the worst mistake in U.S. policy towards Europe since the end of the Cold War. A long list of former officials and diplomats, including Matlock and Nitze, signed a letter to Secretary Christopher in support of Dean's article. In 1997, Dean told Congress the Russian political class in its entirety, with very few exceptions, opposes NATO enlargement and strongly. He said that this is the group which will form the views of the Russian public, with the message that Russia is hostilely encircled and has been cheated by the same countries on the Cold War outcome. This would be especially true, he said, if that enlargement includes the Baltic states bordering directly on Russia. He cited the Duma's reluctance to ratify the START II nuclear weapons treaty and said, quote, the main thing that every one of these costs and risks have in common is that they are completely unnecessary, end quote. Foreign friends. In November 1996, French President Jacques Chirac warned Tony Lake, we have humiliated them too much. One day there will be a dangerous nationalist backlash. On the same theme, Max Jacobinson, the former Finnish ambassador to the UN, warned significantly it is the westernizers who strenuously oppose a NATO expansion. They fear it would provide neo-imperialistic forces with fresh arguments to demand a remilitarization of Russian policy. In 1997, former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating made a direct comparison to the catastrophe of Versailles after World War I, arguing that NATO expansion is an error which may rank in the end with strategic miscalculations which prevented Germany from taking its place in the international system. Okay, so what he is referring to there is that the way that Germany was treated after World War I, where it was like they could never be forgiven, they got like really bad raw end of the deal. They were just treated really badly. They got really bad deals. They weren't allowed to militarize or something like that, and they felt very, very humiliated and treated really badly as a country. And that's sort of what gave rise, right, to the feelings that then rose up to cause the conditions of World War II. And so what this guy is saying is if you just start humiliating countries, especially very proud old countries like Russia, this could cause a really bad backlash in the future. And he's comparing it to what happened with Germany. Sorry, it's like super late. I just wanted to get this chapter read before the end of the week, so I have a couple days before I release it and to edit it, and I can't think of everything very properly. British experts Michael Clark and Michael McGuire warned in 1998 that the first announced round of NATO expansion to Poland, Romania, and Hungary was already too much and that the alliance should stop before they created a crisis. They said keeping Russia cooperative on regional stability, nuclear limits and proliferation, and their territorial ambitions was paramount, and that NATO expansion threatened all three because it is seen by all strands of Russian opinion as violating the bargain struck in 1990 and will likely lead to the withdrawal of cooperation. They said that even though it was too late to rescind the invitations to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in order to mitigate the consequences, the West should from that point forward refrained from integrating them into NATO's military structure by ceasing to insist NATO membership is open to all and by perpetuating the de facto nuclear weapons-free zone that presently exists in Central and Eastern Europe. Kupchan's insight. Council on Foreign Relations Senior Fellow Charles Kupchan, a promoter of the Partnership for Peace concept, was admittedly against NATO expansion in 1994. He wrote that Clinton was resurrecting Europe's dividing lines, and despite the administration's effort to strengthen the CSCE and assurances to Moscow that they meant no harm, enlarging the alliance would alter the balance of power on the continent and make Russia feel less secure. That NATO was directed against Russia was precisely why the Eastern European states wanted to join, but he warned that an expanded NATO would lead Russia to reassert control over its former republics and to remilitarize. The chance to build a European security community that included Russia would be lost. He quoted an advisor to President Yeltsin as well. NATO expands eastward. Russia, under any government, will become a revisionist power striving to undermine the already fragile European order. He also importantly predicted that the expansion would help Russian hawks marginalize reformers. Even if NATO held open the prospect of eventual membership for Russia, nationalists would react to Central Europe's entry into NATO by charging that Russian reformers had sold out to the West and had jeopardized Russia's security. Mandelbaum's crystal ball. International relations scholar Michael Mandelbaum called NATO expansion foolish and dangerous. He told Congress that Russia might someday become a threat to its neighbors, but it is not a threat now, and therefore NATO expansion as planned by the administration is at best premature and at worst counterproductive. He complained that domestic politics was at the core of Clinton's considerations and mocked his 1996 campaign slogan about building a bridge to the 21st century. Mandelbaum told Congress that the, quote, likeliest result of this policy would be restoration of a tradition of European international relations that predates the Cold War, a tradition featuring great power rivalry, shifting alliances, and continuing concern with an unrelegated military balance. He predicted NATO expansion would fulfill one 1996 campaign promise that Bill Clinton did not make. It would be a bridge to the 19th century. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed that reading. Chapter 2, Part 2 of Provoked by Scott Horton. All the links are in the description that are important, like Scott's YouTube channel and his book. The link to get his book is in the description as well. I realize that in this day and age, people are wonky with the Iran war going on, and so everybody's upset with each other on the lines of that. But I feel like it's important to listen to all sides of every topic. But that's how I just deal with topics. I like to hear all sides so I can make my own conclusions about things. Please leave a comment and let me know that you're here and that you're reading along with this book series. I'm not for sure. I think there might be one person. I think there might be one person reading along, but that's okay. Thank you all for being here, and I will see you next time on The Eclectic Journalist.